On June 9, 1944, D+3, a message arrived at German High Command. It came from their most trusted source in England, a man who had been reporting to them for 3 years, a man whose intelligence had been incorporated into OKW situation assessments 62 times, a man the Abwehr in Madrid considered so reliable that they had stopped sending real agents to Britain altogether. He had coverage. He had the whole picture. The message was long. It said the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real blow was still coming. Patton hadn't moved. The bulk of Allied strength, more than 75 divisions remained in southeastern England, pointed at the Pas-de-Calais. OKW accepted the assessment. 19 infantry divisions of the 15th Army sat at Pas-de-Calais and waited for an attack that never came. Along with the armored reserves of OKW, enough force to have posed a serious threat to the beachhead before the Allies could consolidate. They didn't move. One message, one source. 21 divisions parked in the wrong place. What almost nobody knows is that the operation behind that message nearly fell apart 3 separate times before it ever got there. 3 times between 1941 and June 1944, the whole enterprise came within hours of total collapse. 3 times it survived. And each time it came back stronger because every near miss turned out to be a product of the same force that made the June 9th message work. The Germans believed what they already wanted to believe. How one man made that happen and how close he came to failing, that is what this is about. To understand what almost destroyed Operation Fortitude South, you first have to understand what it was. And what it was at its core was a Spanish chicken farmer with a library card and an extraordinary talent for lying. Juan Pujol García was born in Barcelona in 1912. He served in the Spanish Civil War on both sides as it happens and managed across 3 years of brutal conflict to avoid firing a single bullet for either of them. What the war gave him instead of a wound or a medal was a deep-settled loathing of totalitarianism in all its forms, fascist, communist. It didn't matter. By 1940, with Franco's Spain locked into uneasy partnership with Nazi Germany and the rest of Europe, Burning Pujol had decided he wanted to do something about it. He had no military rank, no intelligence training, no connections in any government. What he had was nerve a gift for invention and a wife named Araceli, who was in her own way every bit as consequential to what followed. In January 1941, Araceli walked into the British Embassy in Madrid and offered her husband's services to British intelligence. They turned her down. The British turned Pujol down at least 3 times in total. They saw a civilian with no verifiable assets and no access, exactly the kind of walk-in that intelligence services are trained to distrust. So Pujol did something that most people rejected 3 times by the organization they were trying to help would not have done. He went to the other side. He approached the Abwehr German military intelligence in Madrid. He posed as a fanatical pro-Nazi Spanish official with access to high-level government circles. He had no such access. He had invented it completely on the spot. The Abwehr recruited him, trained him in secret writing, and ciphers gave him a codename Alaric and a network designation Arabal. Then they sent him to England to recruit and run sub-agents on their behalf. He went to Lisbon instead. For approximately 9 months, from mid-1941 to early 1942, Juan Pujol García sat in the Lisbon Public Library and fabricated one of the most trusted spy networks in the history of Nazi Germany. He had never been to England. He reported from England. He used a blue guide to England-British railway timetables, tourist maps, and whatever English-language newspapers he could obtain, and from these he constructed detailed intelligence reports on military movements, troop dispositions, convoy schedules, and the general state of the British war effort. Reports that the Abwehr read, assessed, and incorporated into their understanding of the enemy. The errors in retrospect are extraordinary. He reported that Glasgow men would do anything for a liter of wine. Glaswegians drink beer and whiskey. The Abwehr corrected nothing. They needed him to be real. And so for them, he was. By early 1942, British ultra-intercepts had detected a rogue agent running an uncontrolled operation from Portugal, someone the Germans called Arabelle. MI5 traced the source. They found Pujol in Lisbon doing exactly what he had failed to persuade them to let him do for them. This time, they took him up on it. On April 24, 1942, Pujol arrived in Plymouth by Sunderland flying boat from Gibraltar, met by MI5 officers. His initial codename was Bovril. It was quickly changed to Garbo after Greta Garbo, the greatest actress in the world. The case officer assigned to run him was Tommy Harris. Half Spanish, fluent in the language, a talented artist with a painter's sense of composition and detail. The official history of British intelligence in World War II would later describe what followed as one of those rare partnerships between two exceptionally gifted men whose inventive genius inspired and complemented each other. That is understated. What Harris and Garbo built over the next 2 years was by any measure the most elaborate and consequential deception operation ever mounted by a single agent. They invented 27 fictional subagents, each with a complete cover story, a personality, a set of plausible movements, and a reason the Germans could believe in them. A Venezuelan student in Glasgow, a Welsh nationalist with fascist sympathies running a cell called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order in Swansea. An indiscreet American Army sergeant, a KLM airline pilot who explained the flow of letters from Lisbon. A Swiss banker in London. 27 people who did not exist, whose intelligence reports did. Between 1942 and June 1944, Garbo and Harris sent 315 letters to the Abwehr in Lisbon, averaging 2,000 words each. When radio contact was established in August 1943, they shifted to transmissions more than 500 radio messages from January 1944 to D-Day, 4 or more per day, many marked urgent. 62 of those reports were incorporated directly into OKW situation assessments. The Germans were reading Garbo's fabrications in their morning briefings, and the tactical consequence of all this fiction was real. By 1942, the Abwehr had stopped infiltrating new agents into Britain. Garbo had coverage. If they sent someone real, they might contradict him. And why contradict your best source? The double-cross system, in which every German agent who landed in Britain was either captured, turned, or already working for MI5, was invisible to the Abwehr, in part because Garbo had made it invisible. He was their eyes. They had no others. The Germans paid approximately £31,000 for this entirely invented intelligence, close to £800,000 in today's money. The money went to MI5. When the Germans were slow to pay, Garbo demanded raises, arguing that his agents would stop cooperating unless properly compensated. The Abwehr paid up. He was billing Nazi Germany for agents he hadn't recruited, reporting intelligence he had fabricated, and quietly helping to lose the war for the side that was funding him. And they thought he was magnificent. Here is where the first near-miss begins. In the summer of 1941, Garbo was reporting from a country he had never visited to an intelligence service that believed every word he wrote. The error about Glasgow, the claim that Scots would do anything for a liter of wine, when beer and whiskey were the relevant currencies for anyone who had spent 20 minutes north of the border, should have ended the operation before it began. A single check against reality would have destroyed him. The Abwehr ran no such check. This was not sloppiness alone. It was something more structural. The Abwehr needed a source. A reliable, well-placed, well-connected human intelligence asset in England was what German military intelligence most urgently required in 1941, and they did not have one. Every agent they had tried to insert had been caught, turned, or burned. Garbo arrived apparently well-placed, apparently credible, apparently enthusiastic, And the Abwehr did what institutions under pressure do when they find something that looks like what they need. They accepted it. They filed the wine report without comment. They kept paying. That pattern institutional need overriding institutional skepticism is the engine underneath the entire operation. Not Garbo's brilliance alone, though he was genuinely brilliant. Not the quality of the fabrications, though some were craftily composed. The Abwehr wanted to be fooled, and so, in the most consequential sense, they were. But it was the Operation Torch letter that turned not exposed yet into genuinely trusted. In November 1942, Allied forces landed in North Africa Operation Torch, the first major Anglo-American combined offensive of the war. Garbo had reported on the convoy in the weeks before the landing. The intelligence was real, and the detail was specific, accurate convoy composition, the distinctive camouflage scheme used on the ships, the probable trajectory of their movement. All of it verifiable, all of it genuine, and all of it delivered deliberately too late to matter. The report was postmarked before the landings, but timed to arrive in Lisbon after the troops were already ashore. Accurate enough to prove his access. Safe enough to protect the Allies. The Abwehr's response arrived a few days after the landings. "We are sorry they arrived too late, but your last reports were magnificent." Magnificent. That word is worth pausing on. The Abwehr was congratulating its most trusted source for providing accurate intelligence about an Allied landing intelligence that, had it arrived on time, might have changed what was waiting on the beaches. The report arrived late because of postal delays, they were told. And the Abwehr accepted that explanation because the alternative, that their most reliable asset had timed his report with surgical precision to be harmless, was a thought they could not afford to think. They had built too much on him. The wine gaff hadn't mattered. The late torch report didn't matter. What mattered was that he was real, and he was theirs, and the intelligence confirmed what they already suspected about Allied intentions and capabilities. This is the through line stated plainly for the first time. The Germans didn't scrutinize Garbo's reports because they couldn't afford to. They needed a source. They had accepted a source. Scrutiny was the enemy of the thing they needed to be true. By the end of 1942, the tactical consequence of this credulity was concrete. The Abwehr had stopped trying to infiltrate new agents into Britain. Garbo had coverage. Why send someone real when your best source already had it covered? Every agent they might have sent would have risked contradicting him. Better to trust what they already had. The result was that the network of German agents operating in Britain was by 1942 entirely fictional or entirely under British control. Every piece of intelligence Germany believed it had from inside England passed through M.5's hands before it reached Berlin. Garbo was also by this point managing his fictional agents with the administrative confidence of a small business owner. When the Abwehr was slow to forward funds, he sent messages warning that his sub-agents were threatening to withdraw their cooperation unless properly compensated. The pay demands were tactical. They reinforced the fiction that the agents were real independent, motivated by money rather than ideology, and required careful handling. The Germans believed all of it. They paid on schedule the amounts Garbo requested. The Abwehr's investment in Garbo was by this stage psychological as much as financial. They had commended his reports. They had incorporated his assessments into their situation maps. They had restructured their intelligence collection in Britain around the assumption that he had it covered. To question him now would have been to question everything they had built on top of him. The wine gaff sat in their files unexplained and unchallenged alongside dozens of reports that would eventually inform German High Command's understanding of Allied intentions in northwestern Europe. The operation had survived its first near miss by exploiting what the Abwehr could not bring itself to examine. Garbo hadn't outwitted them. He had simply given them what they needed in a form they were structurally incapable of rejecting. The same force that let the wine gaff slide would 2.5 years later make the June 9th message decisive. There is a phrase in the British intelligence tradition for what Garbo was doing with the torch letter, accurate but harmless. Give the enemy something real enough to be verifiable, real enough to prove your access, and ensure it arrives at a moment when it cannot be acted upon. The Germans got accurate intelligence about the largest Allied offensive mounted to that point. They got it too late, and they thanked him for the accuracy rather than questioning the timing. Accurate but harmless was the formula. The torch letter was its cleanest expression. It would run with variations for 2 more years. The second crisis was different in every way. It would have nothing to do with German skepticism. It would come from The most dangerous moment in the history of Operation Fortitude South had nothing to do with the Germans. It happened on June 21, 1943, in a small house in London when a 23-year-old Spanish woman picked up the telephone. Her name was Araceli González de Pujol. She was Garbo's wife. To understand what she did on that afternoon, you have to understand what her life in London had become. Araceli had been brought to England in the spring of 1942, around the time Garbo arrived in Plymouth. She was young, she spoke no English, and MI5 security protocols barred her from contact with other Spanish speakers, the concern being that she might intentionally or not let something slip in her own language to someone who might be listening. Her husband worked punishing hours with Tommy Harris, constructing dispatches and managing the fiction of 27 agents who did not exist. She was largely alone in a small house, eating wartime British rations, in a city where she could not easily speak to anyone. Cut off from her family, her country, her language, what MI5 had not fully accounted for was who Araceli actually was. She was not a bystander who had been swept up into her husband's adventure. Before Garbo ever had MI5's backing before the flying boat, before Tommy Harris, before the codename, Araceli had personally carried Garbo's spy letters to German handlers in Spain. She had sat across tables from Abwehr officers and delivered the fabricated reports herself. She had helped invent cover stories for the fictional sub-agents. She was an original co-conspirator, not a peripheral figure, not a dependent, not a liability to be managed. She had helped build the network in the first place, and MI5 had taken her weapon and told her to stay home. What MI5 had tried at one point to do about this situation says something about the gap between institutional thinking and human reality. An MI5 officer was dispatched to Lisbon specifically to purchase 12 pairs of silk stockings for Araceli, a significant gesture in wartime Britain where hosiery was rationed and essentially unavailable. The officer returned with the stockings. The situation did not improve. 12 pairs of silk stockings were not, it turned out, an adequate substitute for a life. By June 1943, the resentment had accumulated for 14 months. On June 21st, 11 months before D-Day, with the invasion still a distant plan, and Fortitude South still months from its critical phase, Araceli reached the end of her patience. During a furious argument with Garbo, she picked up the telephone and called Tommy Harris directly. She told him she was going to the Spanish embassy. She was going to tell them everything: who her husband was, who he worked for, what the network was. If she walked into that embassy, the operation was finished. Not damaged, not set back, finished. Every fictional sub-agent, every fabricated report, every piece of credibility Garbo had built with the Abwehr over 2 years gone. D-Day was 11 months away. Fortitude South, the deception that would pin German reserves at Calais while the real invasion hit Normandy, existed in outline but not yet in substance. If the Germans learned through the Spanish embassy that their most trusted source was a British double agent, the entire strategic architecture of the Allied deception plan collapsed with him. Harris had hours to contain it. What followed was theater, which was fitting because theater was the one weapon that MI5 and Garbo both understood. Harris constructed a story Garbo had been arrested. He was being held in MI5 custody after violently objecting to being pulled from duty on the grounds that his wife posed a security risk. An MI5 officer was dispatched to the Pujol house to inform Araceli that her husband had been taken in. The officer arrived and found Araceli in the kitchen with all the gas taps open. The field note he filed afterward contains a sentence that has not lost its edge in 80 years. He estimated there was a 90% chance she was play-acting, but there existed a 10% chance of an accident. Read that sentence again. A trained MI5 officer assessing the scene in front of him could only be 90% certain that the woman in the gas-filled kitchen was performing rather than attempting to die. The detached bureaucratic precision of the phrasing, not "she seemed fine," not "we believe she was bluffing," but a cold probability estimate on a human life, is the sound of an institution doing the mathematics of operational necessity against personal cost. The phrasing also contains, if you read it carefully, an acknowledgement that the officer had made a judgment call, that in the interest of the operation the 10% was acceptable. The officer made his assessment. He proceeded with the plan. Araceli was blindfolded before she left the house. She could not see where she was being taken. The drive across London to Latchmere House in Richmond, Surrey, through wartime streets in the back of a car she had not chosen to get into, lasted long enough to disorient her. Camp 020 was where the real work of the double-cross system happened behind closed doors, where captured German agents were questioned, broken-turned, or imprisoned. The building itself was meant to communicate something. This is real. This is what happens. Your husband is somewhere in here. Garbo was waiting inside. He was dressed in a prison uniform, disheveled, looking like a man who had been processed for incarceration. She burst into tears. She signed a written apology. She pledged never to compromise his work. Then she was driven home. The crisis was over. Fortitude South survived. And anyone telling this story who stops there is telling only half of it. Because what the episode reveals when you hold it up to the light is not a crisis averted, but a cost paid. Araceli had been right. She had helped build the network. MI5 had cut her out of it and expected her silence. The operation required her containment, and MI5 achieved her containment with the same instrument Garbo had used on the Germans, a convincing performance stage, managed to produce a particular reaction. The prison uniform, the dishevelment, the scripted scene in the interrogation room, this was Garbo's Lisbon library all over again. The Germans believed his reports because they needed to. Araceli believed the prison scene because she loved him. Theater meets theater. The mechanism is identical. The Q8 moral framing that governs this documentary requires honesty about what that means. Araceli was not a liability who nearly derailed a righteous operation. She was a participant who had been used and then managed. The operation survived her crisis because MI5 was willing to perform for her in the same register she had performed for German handlers in Madrid, and because Garbo was willing to stand in front of her in a prison uniform and let her believe for a few necessary minutes that he had suffered for her mistake. The marriage never recovered. Araceli and their children left for Spain in 1948. Garbo, by that point, was already dead officially anyway. That comes later. But note what happened in the weeks after June 21, 1943. Garbo's arrest gave him a new legend to use with the Abwehr. The story of a loyal agent so committed to his work that he had violently resisted being pulled from duty was exactly the kind of biographical detail that reinforced Abwehr confidence. His apparent willingness to be imprisoned rather than compromise the operation, even though the imprisonment was fiction, added another layer to the credibility they had already built on him. The second near miss, like the first, left things slightly better than before. Fortitude South had survived its most human crisis. D-Day was now 11 months away. By the spring of 1944, Garbo and Harris had built something that had no precedent in the history of military deception: an entire phantom army. 150,000 men who didn't exist, staged fictitiously in the counties of Kent and Essex, directly opposite the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, 34 kilometers from the Dover coast. The Army had a name, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. It had a headquarters, a signals apparatus, a logistics tail, and a supreme commander the German High Command feared and respected above any other Allied general. That commander was General George S. Patton. Patton was not hiding. He was performing. He toured fake FUSAG camps with photographers present. He attended staged press conferences. He appeared in newsreels. His presence was the deception's most powerful single element because the Germans had reached their own conclusion about Patton, independently of anything Garbo told them. He was the Allies' best armored commander, the man most likely to lead the decisive thrust into France. And it stood to reason that the Allies would use their best man for their most important operation. FUSAG's presence in Kent and Essex confirmed a strategic logic the Germans had already constructed for themselves. Garbo's 500 messages hadn't changed their minds. They had confirmed a conclusion German High Command had already reached. FUSAG was also in part real, which was what made it so difficult to dismiss. Real units were rotated through its order of battle, specifically to generate authentic wireless traffic. German signals intelligence was intercepting genuine transmissions from genuine formations. The rubber tanks and dummy landing craft that German reconnaissance aircraft photographed in southeastern England ports were supported by radio traffic that matched a real Army's operational signature. Garbo's reports about unit movements and troop concentrations were consistent with what German signals intelligence was independently picking up. The fiction and the reality were woven together so tightly that unpicking one would have required unpicking the other. By January 1944, the tempo of Garbo's transmissions had reached its peak. More than 500 radio messages between January and June 6th, 4 or more per day, many flagged urgent. 62 of those reports were incorporated directly into OKW situation assessments, the morning briefings that shaped German High Command's picture of Allied intentions in northwestern Europe. The Germans were reading Garbo's fabrications alongside their own signals, intercepts, their own aerial reconnaissance reports, their own analysis, and Garbo's picture was consistent with all of it, because MI5 had designed it to be. The fiction was calibrated to the facts the Germans already had. It filled in the gaps they had not been able to fill themselves. Underpinning all of it was a German strategic conviction that predated Garbo's entire operation. In November 1943, Hitler had issued Führer Directive No. 51, ordering the reinforcement of the Western Front and the massing of armored reserves to repel any Allied landing. The directive did not name the Pas de Calais explicitly, but the conviction that it was the most likely target was already deeply embedded in German strategic thinking, the shortest channel crossing the most direct route to the Ruhr, the place a rational enemy would choose. German High Command had reached that conclusion through their own analysis long before Garbo's reports arrived. What his 500 messages had done was provide human intelligence corroboration for a belief the Germans had already built. He wasn't leading them anywhere new. He was confirming where they already stood. And then, on the night of June 5, 1944, one of Garbo's most carefully placed subagents, a fictional agent in Southampton, reported something real. The embarkation kits had been issued. Vomit bags were being distributed. The fleet was moving. Garbo sent an urgent warning to Madrid at approximately 11 at night, instructing his handlers to stand by for a critical transmission at 3 in the morning. At 3 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Garbo transmitted. Madrid did not respond. The radio operators in Madrid had gone off the air at 11:30. Their shift ended. No one had told them to stay. No one had thought to tell them on the night before the largest Allied amphibious operation of the war that their most important asset was about to send the most consequential message of his career. They had gone home. Garbo transmitted into silence. He waited. Nothing. He transmitted again. Nothing. At 8 in the morning, Madrid finally responded. By then, the invasion fleet was already visible from the French coast. The first waves had hit the beaches at 6:30 in the morning. The paratroopers had been on the ground since shortly after midnight. Garbo's warning, the message that might have put German forces on full alert before the landings arrived after the landings had begun. It was operationally useless. Garbo's response was a masterpiece of controlled fury. He sent a rebuke to Madrid that became, paradoxically, one of the most effective messages he ever transmitted. I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon the work. The Germans felt terrible. Their best source had risked everything to warn them, in time had transmitted alone in the night to handlers who weren't listening, and had been failed by their own operational sloppiness. The guilt was immediate and genuine. And guilt, as it turned out, was a form of belief. When Garbo's next major communication arrived 3 days later, the Abwehr received it in the psychological register of men who owed him something. They had failed him once. They were not going to dismiss what he was telling them now. The missed contact on June 5th, the third near miss, the one that came closest to making Garbo irrelevant at the most critical moment, had paradoxically enhanced his credibility for the message that mattered most. The MI5 official history noted this with characteristic understatement. The missed contact had earned Garbo additional credit for reliability. This is what the three near misses have in common. The first crisis survived because the Abwehr needed Garbo to be real, more than they needed to scrutinize him. The second survived because MRMY5 understood that theater could contain theater. The third survived, became an asset, because the Germans' guilt was another expression of the same conviction that had protected the operation from the beginning. They believed in him. Every crisis that tested that belief left the belief slightly stronger than before. The operator who failed to appear at his radio at 3 in the morning on June 6, 1944, may have contributed more to what followed than anyone who showed up on time. 3 days later, with the beachhead still fragile and the German command structure still arguing about what the landings meant, Garbo sat down to write. 3 days after D-Day, the Normandy beachhead was not secure. This is not hindsight pessimism. It was the operational reality on June 9, 1944. The Americans at Omaha had clawed their way off the beach, but the perimeter they held was thin and contested. The German 7th Army was reinforcing from the south. Rommel, commanding Army Group B, was pushing hard for his Panzer reserves to move north and hit the landing zones before the Allies could consolidate. The question of whether Normandy would hold was genuinely open, and sitting 300 kilometers to the northeast doing nothing was the 15th Army. 19 infantry divisions under General Oberst Hans von Salmuth, garrisoning the Pas-de-Calais sector, along with armored reserves held at OKW-level formations that could have reached the Normandy perimeter within days if ordered south. Enough combined strength to have posed a serious threat to the Allied lodgment before it could consolidate, before Operation Cobra, before the breakout, before any of what followed. The men who held the Omaha sector on June 9th had no Panzer reserve behind them. If the 15th Army had moved, there was very little in its path. It did not move, but understanding why requires understanding what was happening inside the German command structure, because Garbo's message arrived into a situation already structured against movement. The fundamental problem for the Germans was not intelligence. It was command. The Panzer reserves of Army Group B were not under Rommel's authority alone. Rundstedt, commanding OB West, had his own view. OKW in Rastenburg had Hitler's. The three authorities disagreed about doctrine. Rommel wanted armor forward at the beaches to destroy the landing before it could consolidate. Rundstedt wanted it held in reserve to respond once the main blow was identified. Hitler had issued a standing order that the Panzer reserves could not be committed without his personal authorization. On June 6th, Hitler had been asleep when the landings began. His staff had not woken him. By the time authorization came through, Allied fighter bombers were already making daylight movement along French roads, a death sentence for armored columns. Rommel's own view by D+2 was that moving armor in daylight was not a tactical risk. It was a guarantee of destruction from the air. This was the structure into which Garbo's message arrived. It was also not only Garbo making the case. Brutus and Tricycle. Two other double agents running within the same double-cross network had spent months feeding the same FUSAG narrative into German assessments. The signals traffic from Kent and Essex, the reconnaissance photographs of dummy installations, the consistent pattern of Garbo's 500 previous messages, all of it had built a picture. Garbo wrote the last sentence. But the walls had been under construction for years. On June 9, 1944, D+3, Garbo sat down with Tommy Harris and composed the most important message of his career. What it said in precise terms, no verbatim transcript has ever been publicly released from the National Archives files. What is known is its substance. FUSAG, under Patton, remained in southeastern England, unmoved. The Normandy operation was a diversion, a large one, but a diversion. The bulk of Allied strength, more than 75 divisions, remained uncommitted in the United Kingdom, pointed at the Pas de Calais. The real assault was still coming. He requested urgent transmission to German High Command. Then he and Harris waited. The message had to travel from London to Madrid, be decoded, be assessed by intelligence officers trying to determine whether the largest Allied operation in history was a diversion or the main event, and then be forwarded up a command chain that was at that moment paralyzed by its own internal contradictions. Into that paralysis came Garbo's message. The message reached OKW German Armed Forces High Command within hours. Whether Hitler read it himself or absorbed it through his morning briefings, the effect was the same. OKW accepted the assessment. Von Rundstedt refused Rommel's request to move 15th Army divisions south from Calais to reinforce Normandy. The armored reserves held at OKW level were not released. The bulk of the 15th Army's 19 infantry divisions remained frozen at the Pas de Calais through the critical weeks of June and into July. Units were released only gradually piecemeal as the Germans slowly accepted what Garbo had told them was impossible. By the time that acceptance came, Operation Cobra had already launched July 25th, and the Wehrmacht in France was broken. Now, what did Garbo actually cause? The honest answer, and the more interesting one, is that Garbo's June 9th message did not create the German decision to hold at Calais. It confirmed it. Hitler's pre-existing assumptions, reinforced by German strategic analysis and months of Allied deception, had already made the Pas de Calais appear the most dangerous possibility. The command dysfunction between Rommel-Rundstedt and OKW had already ensured that no single commander could move the Panzer reserves without Hitler's express authorization. Allied air superiority had already made daylight armored movement through France close to suicidal. The 15th Army was not going to move easily, regardless of what any intelligence report said. What Garbo's message did was arrive at the exact moment German High Command was beginning to waver. Beginning to look at the scale of the Normandy operation, the tonnage coming ashore, the air umbrella, the naval gunfire, and ask whether this might in fact be the main event. Rommel was asking that question. Some at OKW were asking it. And at that moment, from their most trusted, most guilt-laden, most credible source, came the answer, no. FUSAG is still there. Patton hasn't moved. Normandy is the feint. The message confirmed a conviction the Germans had already built for themselves at the exact moment that conviction needed reinforcement. Garbo wasn't fooling them. He was giving them permission to keep believing. The British official history is precise about this. The German retention of forces at Calais really might have tipped the balance in Normandy, not that it would have not, that Garbo single-handedly saved the landing. Might have, under certain circumstances. At that particular moment in June. But consider what might have means. Next to these facts, a thin Allied perimeter on June 9th, no Panzer reserve behind the American lines, and 19 German divisions that could have reached the beaches within days. Might have is a very large phrase. The confirmation came back from Madrid. OKW had accepted the assessment. The 15th Army would hold at Calais. The decision had been made at the highest level of German command on the basis of a message from a man in a London flat, a man who had never fired a weapon in any war, who had spent 3 years building a spy network out of library books and tourist maps, and who had on the evening of June 9, 1944, done the one thing he had always done best. He had told them what they already wanted to hear. On July the 29th, 1944, 7 weeks after the June 9th telegram, a radio message arrived for Garbo from the Abwehr station in Madrid. The Führer himself had awarded him the Iron Cross Second Class for extraordinary services to Germany. The award required Hitler's personal authorization. It was normally reserved for frontline combat. Garbo had earned it, the Germans believed, through 3 years of intelligence work so precise, so consistent, and so operationally consequential that it had, from their perspective, genuinely altered the course of the war. They were right. It had altered the course of the war, just not in the direction they imagined. Garbo and Harris sat down to compose the acceptance. What they wrote was this: I cannot at this moment, when emotion overcomes me, express in words my gratitude for the decoration conceded by our Führer, to whom humbly and with every respect I express my gratitude for the high distinction which he has bestowed on me, for which I feel myself unworthy, as I have never done more than what I considered to be the fulfillment of my duty. Read that slowly. Every word of it is true. He had never done more than what he considered the fulfillment of his duty. His duty, as he understood it, was to help defeat Nazi Germany. He had done exactly that with more effect than almost anyone else in the war. The sentence is perfectly invisibly honest. The Abwehr read it as the sincere gratitude of a loyal agent overcome by recognition. It was in fact a description of a man who had spent 3 years lying to them in service of everything they were trying to destroy. On November 25, 1944, ELI-5 Director General Sir David Petrie presented Garbo with a member of the Order of the British Empire, the MBE. A different ceremony, a different building, a different set of people in the room. Juan Pujol García is the only person in the recorded history of the Second World War to have received both the Iron Cross from Nazi Germany and the MBE from the British Crown for actions in the same conflict. To understand what those two medals represent, it helps to trace what the held divisions had actually meant on the ground. Through June and July 1944, while the 15th Army's 19 divisions waited at the Pas de Calais for an attack that never came, the Allies were doing something irreversible on the Normandy coast building. Mulberry Harbor's prefabricated portable harbors towed across the channel were offloading supplies at a rate that transformed the beachhead from a towhold into a logistical base. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel were coming ashore each week. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th and broke through the German line near St. Lo, the Allied position in Normandy was not the fragile perimeter of June 9th. It was an army group fully supplied with momentum and air superiority and a clear path toward the Seine. The 19 divisions sitting at Calais did not take part in any of that. They garrisoned a stretch of coastline against an invasion that existed only on paper in the reports of an agent who was having lunch in London. The cost of their absence from Normandy is impossible to calculate with precision. The benefit to the Allies of their absence is not. The operation itself was already winding down. In August 1944, Garbo had been warned that his cover was in danger of being compromised, the Abwehr's Madrid network was under pressure, and the risk of exposure was growing. He was stood down. Fortitude South had served its purpose. The beachhead was consolidated, the breakout was complete, and the Wehrmacht in France was in retreat. The deception that had held 19 divisions at Calais through the critical weeks was no longer needed. The war it had helped to turn was moving toward its end. What Garbo did next was in its way as audacious as anything he had done during the war. He vanished. In 1948, he instructed Tommy Harris to announce his death malaria contracted in Angola on a post-war trip. In 1949, the British ambassador to Spain officially notified the Spanish government that Juan Pujol García had died. His wife and children, who had already returned to Spain, were told he was gone. He moved to Caracas, Venezuela, changed his name, opened a bookshop later, a stationery store. He remarried. He built a quiet life in a city where nobody knew who he was or what he had done. The reasons for the disappearance were practical. A former double agent living under his own name in post-war Europe carried real risks from surviving Abwehr officers and from the various intelligence services now reorganizing in the Cold War's early confusion. But they were also something more personal. Garbo had spent 3 years performing. He had been simultaneously a devoted agent of British intelligence, a trusted asset of Nazi Germany, a husband who let his wife believe he had been arrested, and a father who had raised 2 sons while conducting one of the most complex deceptions in military history from a London office. The performance had required him to maintain without a single significant lapse a false identity to his German handlers, a carefully managed presence to MY5, and something approaching a normal domestic life to his family. Araceli had left for Spain with the children in 1948. The marriage, fractured by the gas taps crisis and the years of enforced isolation that preceded it, did not survive the peace. Juan Pujol García, in the end, was a man who had helped to save a continent and lost his family in the process. The simplest way to stop performing was to disappear. Tommy Harris died in January 1964, a car crash on a road outside Luque Major on the island of Majorca. No mechanical fault was ever found. MI5 had been attempting to interview him in connection with the Kim Philby investigation. Philby, the Soviet mole inside British intelligence, had been Harris's close friend. Harris died before MI5 could ask him what he knew. The official verdict was an accident. It remains the official verdict. In 1984, a British intelligence historian named Rupert Allison tracked Garbo to Venezuela. Garbo came back to London. He was received by Prince Philip. And on June 6, 1984, 40 years to the day after the landings, he went back to Normandy. On June 6, 1984, 40 years to the day after the landing, Juan Pujol García walked the beaches of Normandy alone. He was 72 years old. He had been dead officially for 35 years. And nobody on those beaches knew who he was. He had come a long way to stand in a place he had never directly saved, a beach he had helped protect from 300 kilometers away, through a typewriter, through a radio, through 27 people who didn't exist. The men who had died here on June 6, 1944, had not known his name. The men who survived had not known it either. The soldiers who clawed off Omaha Beach and held the perimeter through June 9th did not know that at the moment they were holding it, a message was traveling from a London flat to a German situation room that would determine whether 19 divisions came south to destroy them. They just held the line and hoped. The decision that kept those divisions away, 19 infantry divisions staying at Calais, the Panzer reserves standing down the beachhead, getting the 6 weeks it needed to become something unbreakable, had been made in a situation room in Germany by people reading a message from a man they had never met, trusting a source they had never verified, confirming a belief they had constructed entirely on their own. What Garbo knew standing on that beach in 1984 was the full shape of the thing. He had watched it from the inside, from the beginning. He had known in June 1941, sitting in the Lisbon Library, that the operation worked not because he was clever, but because the Abwehr needed it to work. He had known after the Torch letter That magnificent was the sound of an institution congratulating itself for believing what it wanted to believe. He had known in the hours after composing the June 9th message that the telegram's power came not from what it said, but from what the Germans had already decided. And he had known, standing in Tommy Harris's office when the Iron Cross confirmation arrived, that the acceptance he and Harris had written was the most honest thing he had ever sent them. That is what the documents show. Not that Garbo fooled the Germans, that he confirmed them. Here is what is beyond serious dispute. On June 9, 1944, with the beachhead 3 days old and still fragile, 19 infantry divisions and the armored reserves of OKW sat at the Pas de Calais and waited for an attack that never came. They waited because of Hitler's own strategic conviction, a dysfunctional command structure, Allied air superiority, and a deception system built by dozens of people over 3 years. And at the center of that system on June 9th was a man in a London flat who had spent 3 years telling them exactly what they already wanted to hear. He didn't change their minds. He never had to. He just made sure they didn't change it themselves. The Glasgow wine gaffe didn't expose him because the Abwehr needed him to be real. The gas taps crisis didn't destroy the operation because M1I5 understood that theater could answer theater. And the missed radio contact on the night of June 5th, the one that made his warning arrive too late, turned into his greatest credential, because German guilt is still a form of belief. 3 near misses, 3 recoveries, each one stronger than the last because each one was powered by the same engine, the Germans' own conviction acting as the operation's armor. He died in Caracas on October 10, 1988. He was 76 years old. The Iron Cross and the MBE were presumably somewhere in the same room, though in what order they were kept, nobody thought to record. The lie worked because it wasn't really a lie. It was a confirmation. The Germans already believed Normandy was a feint. The Germans already believed FUSAG was real. The Germans already believed Patton was coming for Calais. Garbo just gave them the permission to keep believing. And in war, as it turns out, permission is everything.